Okay, so here we are. Two ideas. One's a process, evolution by natural selection. As I mentioned, selection is a poor choice of words. It implies a selector. Maybe even like God is a selector, or humans are selectors. No, there is no selectors. Organisms are born with what they have. If those traits allow them to survive and reproduce better than others, they leave more in the future generation. The populations are then composed of those individuals from parents who were better. What? Huh? What was that? I want to talk. Selection. You're out of here. Okay. Now, the second great idea was descent from a common ancestor. Just like you are all descended from a common ancestors, your parents. And then before them, right? Go way back in time. Perhaps you have you're part of a lineage that's been around for a long time. Who knows? Okay, so you've inherited traits from your parents. As we mentioned earlier, some of you look like your parents and your brothers and sisters, and others look like the milkman. But that's to be expected. Okay, so those are the two ideas that are the most important. The first one we're going to learn about is natural selection, the process. But I want you to remember, things didn't just pop up by accident. Everything that was alive on this planet, and that was alive, was descended from a common ancestor. In fact, we share a common ancestor, we share a common ancestor with some kind of bacteria. In fact, even before there was DNA, there was RNA. It might have been an ancestor that was all RNA. Okay? So, it only looks like Earth evolved life once. It might have happened that there's other forms of life that were around that went extinct that didn't use the same genetic code. It could be that there's forms of life that we don't recognize as forms of life that are still on this planet. But at this point, it only looks like it only happened once. And then, this is the diversity that we see. Okay. About that. Okay. So, these mutations lead to alleles. Remember? New alleles. These are alleles that go extinct. So, an allele that confers a benefit starts with a mutation. It may or may not get into the population. If it does and it's beneficial, it expands. Old variants, old alleles, they may still be good. They stay around the population, or they may be neutral, or in the new population they may be less beneficial, and they'll go extinct from natural selection. So I mentioned last time about wolves and density of the fur, and let's say there's global warming going on now. We would expect that wolves with less thick fur will probably reproduce better than those with really, really thick fur. So in that environment, thinner fur, because it's going to be so warm, is going to be more beneficial for the wolves. If it turns around and it gets cold like another ice age, what was formerly selected against, which was dense fur, is now favored. The population will still have variation. Some individuals will have thinner fur and some will have thicker. There'll be a mean of, let's say, we'll say 10 centimeters in length. And now it's gotten colder, and fur that's, let's say, up to 16 or 17 would be better. those individuals will leave more offspring, the ones with thicker fur, and eventually the population will shift. So there's no one allele or trait that is better in all environments. Yes?
What does that mean in
Allele?
No, the word, like, what is that?
Allele? Sorry. Here, let me rewrite it. Okay, and I'll read it. I'll write it now correctly. Oh, come on. Don't do that. Okay. Okay. So this is what happens. Allele frequencies, the frequency of each different kind of allele fluctuates in the population. Some alleles in certain environments will be favored, others will be disfavored, selected against. So here's our essential concepts again. An allele is a variant of a gene. In this model, we have basically two alleles, A1 and A2. Okay? Now, these are chickens, and a chicken is a diploid individual and has a chromosome from an identical chromosome homologous from one parent and from the other, so it has two homologous chromosomes. The individual can either be one of three genotypes. It can be A1, okay, that's blue. So all these blue chickens here, that's A1, okay? Now, and that means this is for the whole population of alleles. Forget about individuals, this is the number of alleles that are floating around in the population. Individuals that have this allele, that's A2, okay, and that's homozygous A2. And then finally, we have heterozygous. We talked a little bit about this earlier. A heterozygous individual has one of A1 and one of A2. Okay. And so if you think that it's random, let's say it's random mating between these chickens, everybody goes for everybody. So their alleles are all floating around in the population. Some of them will end up like this. Let's say this guy and this guy will get together and we'll end up with green. This guy and this guy will end up and we'll end up with this yellow color. This guy and this guy will end up blue, right? And then we'll end up in the next generation, if there's no selection, basically the same as what we had before. Okay? So alleles mix up. We'll call that a, a gene pool. So the gene pool is all the alleles that each individual will have two alleles. They could be identical, they could be different. That will all go into the gene pool, they'll mix. You'll get up certain individuals that are born, and that'll be the next generation. So, there's different forces of evolution. The first one we're going to deal with, of course, is natural selection. Just want you to know that. Oops. Okay. But there's also mutation, because if you didn't have mutation, you wouldn't have variation. So mutation is the source of all variation. Then there's something we'll get into, genetic drift, non-random mating, which I'm sure you all practice, and then migration. Okay, so these are the forces of evolution that can change allele frequencies in the population. The only one that can lead to what's called an adaptation, some beneficial allele and some beneficial trait, is natural selection. All the other ones are fairly random. Okay, so where did Darwin get the idea of natural selection? You could say maybe he got it when he was traveling around the world in a Biol as a naturalist when he was like in his 20s. But since he was a high-born individual, he had a lot of time on his hands, and what a lot of high-born individuals did was they did selective breeding with animals and plants. Now, if you look on the left where the corn is, this is the actual ancestor of corn. It's called teosinte. Here are all these, right here, these are all these pigeons. And if you have time on your hands, you would play around and you breed all these different kinds of pigeons. It's called artificial selection. That means there actually is someone selecting. I'm selecting for certain traits. With the corn, I'm selecting for bigger kernels, let's say. For the dogs, depending on what they do, I'm selecting for what they're going to do. Let's say they're little terriers, they're going after rats, so I'm going to breed them small. The pigeons do different things. They look different. Some of them are called rollers. They fly around and all of a sudden they go limp and they roll, and then they come back to life before they hit the ground. These are just playthings of the rich, right? Okay. So this is artificial selection, and Darwin essentially made the leap from artificial selection to what we call natural selection. But instead of someone picking a trait, it's the environment that an organism finds itself in, whether it is favored or not. Now remember, the individual does not evolve. Only the population does. So if an individual has all the traits that make it likely it's going to survive and reproduce, and it does, then it will leave more offspring and more genes in the next environment. But there's no one selecting this. It's the environment they find themselves in. So, like I mentioned about the wolves, you can have dense fur, thin fur, whatever. In certain environments, one will be favored over the other. Either it's too warm, and so dense fur, you'll be like running around with an overcoat, or thin fur, you're freezing to death, right? Okay. Okay, as I mentioned, selection, oh come on, it's an unfortunate choice of words because it implies something with a mind that's selecting, and that's not the case. So I'll give you an example. We say that individuals don't evolve, selection acts on individuals, populations then evolve because certain individuals are favored and they pass on their genes compared to other ones. Well, let's say we make believe that instead of people or organisms, we're just going to talk about cells in our body. Now, we know that our cells are controlled. We'll get into it much more later in the semester and how they're controlled, but it's important they're controlled so they don't go crazy and, like, let's say, become cancerous. Well, occasionally a cell will mutate when it's dividing, let's say a liver cell, and this mutation makes it a little bit more likely that it's going to grow out of control. And then later on, that lineage gets another mutation, and finally we have a whole bunch of cells. They start dividing and dividing. They're not being controlled. They become bigger and bigger. In other words, they're better at reproducing than all the other cells around them. Right? Each one cell is an individual. In this case, those that can reproduce flagrantly, how's that for a term? Like easily, when they shouldn't, they will divide more often and leave more cells. Now that doesn't seem very good, right? So the body has a bunch of things to stop it. But let's say over time, it doesn't. You get these big tumors that are made of these cells that are all pretty much identical. Some of them have new mutations along the way when they divide. And eventually, this cancer spreads in the body because these cells have traits that allow them to do that. In other words, they're winning the evolutionary game, and lo and behold, they kill themselves. How? They kill the host. Now that doesn't seem like a very smart thing to do, does it? But selection is not perfect. Sometimes things have traits that appear to make them better in the competition for life, and yet they actually end up causing their own demise. So that's what I mean by there's no one selected, oh, this snail wants to have thicker shells, and so there's mutation and there's thicker shells. No, it doesn't work like that. There's individuals that, let's say, have certain sickness, and let's say there is a mutation, and that mutation in the next offspring makes slightly thicker shells. Okay? And that's better because there's spring traps around. It has nothing to do with what an organism or a cell wants. It doesn't want anything. I know you want things. You might want an ice cream right now. You might want a hot babe. You might want a hot guy. Whatever it is you want, you make choices, right? Well, it doesn't matter. Wanting. In evolution, it doesn't matter. It has nothing to do with what is favored and what isn't. Individuals that have certain traits that are favored in certain environments leave more offspring. Okay. Now, natural selection is different than evolution by natural selection. So this is what we talked about. Any consistent difference in survival. So this is evolution by natural selection. In survival or reproduction among genotypically, remember genes, variants, alleles, or phenotype. Phenotype is, we all have a phenotype. We have an anatomic phenotype. We have a physiological phenotype. This is actually what selection works on. And then there's the underlying genotype, which is the genes that are involved in somewhat causing the phenotype. So a phenotype can be behavior. They over there behave in a certain way by being rude. Okay, they can't help it, they just have that phenotype. It's called the rude phenotype over there. Okay? Now, the rest of you aren't doing that, and I love you for it. Okay? But unfortunately, what we should all do is get up and go over and pound those people. But I guess we're not. Okay. Now, so in this little sentence here, so genotype is the genes, phenotype is behavior, anatomy, physiology, development, and then survival and reproduction. So really the most important thing is reproduction. Even if you survive for a shorter period of time, but leave more offspring, you're still a winner. May not make you feel better, because you'll be dead, let's say, but still, you're a winner. Okay. And different classes of organisms. So in this case, let's say with the wolves, thin or thick fur, something like that. Okay. Oh, who's that? I'll talk to him if you want. Oh, okay. Natural selection is the force that's actually modifying the population. In other words, it's sifting. It sorts traits by seed. Those traits that are favored get through. The ones that don't, they get selected against, and they get run out of the population. Okay? So, natural selection is the only mechanism that consistently favors traits that increase an individual's fitness. Now, below, let's look at these terms. Fitness is an individual's ability to survive and reproduce. The most important word here is reproduce. Even if you don't survive as long, but you leave more offspring, you're going to leave more genetic material into the next generation. But of course, if you don't survive long enough to have to reproduce, then you lost, right? So you have to survive a certain amount of time. And then an adaptation is a trait that increases an individual's ability to survive and reproduce. So, here are all these different adaptations in animals. We've got this snake over here. It's a constrictor. Right? Now, what's its advantage, do you think? Anybody? Look at that snake. What advantage does it have over, let's say, a snake that was green? Camouflage, right. Okay. So, in this environment now, it turns out, let's say, that climate changes and the background is no longer that color, like leaves, dead leaves on the ground. That snake would not be favored anymore, would it? The same with these different insects that look like leaves. That one is on a green background. It wouldn't do very well on this background, would it? Okay? So, these are all examples of camouflage. Now, in this case, we've got the trait is height. And the individual, if all the animals eat all the stuff that's lower to the ground, there'll be nothing left. So individuals who have a little bit more height can reach higher into the tree, get food, compared to individuals that can't. And let's say there's a famine, where there's few leaves, only the ones left at the top, they're the ones who survive. Okay? Okay. Now, these are all adaptations. Every single one of them. Now, as I mentioned, things can appear to be adaptations on one level, but are actually detrimental or deleterious, we call it, like those cancer cells. Or, for the wolves, long fur or thin fur, depending on the environment, or the periwinkles that we looked at. Periwinkles without crabs, the ones that have thinner shells actually are more likely to leave offspring than the ones with thicker shells, because they don't have to use as much resources as the other ones do, right? So it's all dependent on the environmental context in terms of what phenotype or what trait an individual will have that will make it leave more offspring compared to others. Okay, so we talked about this earlier, I think. If a lion eats you, is that natural selection? Okay, we can agree on that. Now, You're thinking, oh, the lion selected him. No. You might have thought about, oh, that would be a nice tasty meal, but it just so happens that I'm out walking with a friend of mine, and a lion comes along, or let's say a bear comes along, and one of us is going to survive, the one who runs faster, right? But the one who runs faster only has to run faster as fast as the other one. So it doesn't mean like you have to burn down the track. As long as your poor friend who's slow is left behind, he's the one that's going to get eaten. Right? It's simple. If you want to help him a little bit, you can always trip him up. And then he's the one that gets chomped on. Right? Okay. Now that's also selection. In this case, you're being a selective agent by being an asshole. Right? But who's going to tell? Okay. If you get the girl and I don't, is that selection? No? Who said no and who said yes? No's. I heard a no. Okay. Anybody say yes? And most of you, who cares? Right? Okay. This is a form of selection. It's sexual selection. Now, it turns out the guy who gets the girl more often than the guy who doesn't is likely to leave more offspring. So, you think about these bad boys that are out there. I know they're out there. I can see some of them. Oh yeah, they're bad. But some of the ladies like them, and they spread their seed everywhere, and they may not marry the girl, but they leave lots of offspring. Good deal for them. They might get some old poor slob who actually raises, like the milkman. He gets someone else to raise his offspring, right? While he can go and play around. Okay. That's a kind of selection. It's not a selection on survival, it's a selection on reproduction, though it might affect his survival in that he might finally steal the girl from someone who gets pissed and shoots him in the head and he dies. And then he's not having sex anymore. But he might, let's say, have had sex with 120 women by the time he was 22. He dies, he still leaves more offspring in the future. Okay. If I bop you on the head and kill you, is that natural selection? No? No. Yes. Okay. Some people are saying no, some people, why would it be, let's say no. Why would it be no? Well, not really. Let's say remember this, let's say the one I bought on the head is the one that steals my girlfriend. Right? The one who's the bad boy. Okay? Let's say I get to him before he actually does any damage. Now, it'd be like a lion coming along and eating him, right? He'd still be gone. Now, even if he's gone, it doesn't mean that there'll be evolution, because it could be just, like you said, an accident. But in some cases, this is part of the play of, getting reproduction, finding mates, all that. Those that do it better leave more offspring. It's likely that they're going to leave more genes. And so the alleles in the next generation are going to be predominantly his, or mine, whatever. And if it's change in allele, consistent change in alleles for a specific trait, then those individuals have higher fitness. That's all it is. Okay. If a pine cone hits you on the head, is that natural selection? It actually is natural selection, but it's not likely. Well, we'll say it is natural selection. We're going to get to the bottom of this, though, in a second. How about if you get hit by a bus? Is that natural selection? No. Yes. Okay, good. Well, I haven't said anything yet. Is there a difference between natural selection and evolution by natural selection? Okay. Now, which of the previous up here might result in evolution by natural selection? The lion? Yeah, perhaps, because your friend is slow. You get the girl? Yeah. Might be that guy's going to leave more offspring, or she's going to leave more offspring than someone else. If I bop you on the head and kill you. Now, will that consistently lead to a difference of some people being the boppers and some people being the bopped? It could. There's always bullies that are running around beating up on people. That's consistent. They're going to actually leave more offspring in the next generation, unless perhaps the social environment gets so toxic that everybody goes out and kills those people. Then there's selection against them. So, the bopping, it's the same sort of thing. If a pine cone hits you on the head, well, that's natural selection. Something just killed you. But it's not like you can evolve or you can have a trait that protects you from a pine cone. I mean, some people will have thicker heads and all that, but in the end, it's not the kind of action where pine cones are dropping all the time and those with thicker heads leave more offspring. No, it's a random event. So in this case, there's natural selection. All these things are natural selection, only some of them lead to evolution by natural selection. So the pine cone is a random thing. It would be like an asteroid striking the earth, wiped out the dinosaurs. There was no trait variance in the dinosaurs. They all died. Okay? It's not like future generations would be more likely to survive an asteroid. No. Okay? It was a random event. If you get hit by a bus, is that natural selection? Some said no, some said yes. It's yes. Doesn't mean it's going to lead to evolution by natural selection. It only means that, this individual who got hit by the bus isn't going to leave anything except, a lot of tears. Now, is there anything, though, could you actually get evolution by natural selection with an individual some individual who gets hit by a bus, another one who gets hit by a bus, but one lives, but one dies? Let's say there's a difference in thickness of the skin or the bones or something like that. There's a consistent difference of getting hit by buses, and those with thicker bones survive more often. The future generation will end up with individuals with thicker bones. But what's likely to happen here is that some individuals pay more attention to their surroundings. The ones that just kind of wander off, smack, they're dead, right? So it selects for, or it favors, individuals who are aware of their surroundings. So if any of you get hit by a bus, I already told you so. Okay? That is natural selection. It can actually lead to evolution by natural selection in that the ones that survive are the ones that pay attention to their surroundings. And if that's a genetic influence underneath it all, then it'll be passed down. So, there's a difference. Natural selection or selection is anything that happens in our life, whether it favors us or disfavors us, okay? Only some things that happen again and again and again are likely to result in evolution by natural selection. Okay? I want you to think about that. Oh, that's right. I forgot one thing. Do you guys think that humans are still evolving? No? Yes? Okay. If you said yes, why? Anybody? Who said yes? Well, no one said yes now. Come on. Yeah.
I think our brains are evolving because of all the technology and stuff that we're like super savvy.
Okay. So, nowadays, you almost don't have to remember anything. You can look it up or go to Google, or you certainly don't have to remember phone numbers. I used to be great at remembering, so perhaps remembering or having a good memory in the past was favored. But there's less selection. There's a relaxation of selection on that now. And perhaps in future generations we'll have a bunch of humans that can't remember vividly, but they all have to do is go to their device. It'll say, oh, go to the market. Get avocados, right? Don't have to remember anything. Okay. Anybody who says they're not changing? Okay. Anybody? I know someone did. Come on.
What about like ethnicity mixing?
What?
Ethnicity mixing? Can I count as evolving?
Well, let's see. Right now it's probably evolving because there's probably relaxed selection on. In the past, if you were in a small group and a foreigner came around, would you be likely to say, oh, come on over here and share my resources? No. So you had groups that would defend each other. We'll say they're ethnic groups, right? Nowadays, there's a lot of interchange, especially in this country in the West, where people are marrying all sorts of different people. And so perhaps ethnicity is kind of being, there's less of it. Instead of groups marrying within groups, there's more gene flow between. Okay? Now, certainly, in the past, let's say the civil rights movement, right? There was strong selection against being black, right? There was. It was terrible, but it was selection. Now, fortunately, remember that there's a lot of cultural evolution that goes on that actually led to those changes so that everyone is treated more equally now, not necessarily perfectly, but better than it was. Okay. It turns out anybody in here was lactose intolerant. Okay. Anybody, and the rest of you are lactose tolerant, you can drink milk and stuff? Okay. Okay. Well, why is that? Well, it turns out, if your ancestors were in a dairying culture, where they had animals that produced milk, and there was a mutation in one of these individuals that allowed that person at adulthood to still drink milk and not get sick, that person might leave more offspring. And that's exactly why there are some people who are lactose tolerant, some people, now that all happened in the last 2,000 years. That's actually been proven. Okay? That's an example of modern humans evolving. The population change. Yes?
I'm not lactose intolerant. My mom is lactose intolerant.
So it could be that, was she always lactose intolerant? No. Yeah, okay, so in this case, probably what happened is physiologically, as she got older, a lot of times things don't work as well when you get older. And so perhaps she was at one point lactose tolerant, but that gene that produces lactase, which is what breaks down milk, is no longer doing its job properly. But there are certainly people like Asian origin or Native American. Most of those people from those areas are lactose intolerant because they didn't have dairying cultures. Okay? Where others did. Okay. I meant to get. I'll tell you what. I'm gonna open up. You guys can go, but I'm gonna open up some questions on top hat you can answer, and I'll close it. Let's say this afternoon, okay, or this evening. So you can do it wherever you want. Okay. The last lecture, I asked you, is this evolution where a lion eats someone? is this evolution where I bop someone on the head and kill them? Is this evolution where a bus hits me or something like that? Well, those are all examples of natural selection, but not necessarily evolution by natural selection. You have to meet certain requirements for there to be evolution by natural selection. In fact, you need 4 requirements, I think it is. We'll look at it right now. The first is, there has to be variation in the population. So, we were talking about this predator and body size. If everybody in this room was a clone and exactly the same height, right? There's no variation there whatsoever. It doesn't matter if selection would favor an individual who's, let's say, smaller or larger than that everybody's body height at the same point, let's say 6 feet tall. If there's no variation, there cannot be evolution by natural selection. Selection only works if there's actually variation available in the population. So you're born with certain attributes, let's say body size. And if there's a selection on body size, let's say for survival, then natural selection, evolution by natural selection can actually work. Comes along, kills all the big ones, small ones are left over. Okay? Now remember, selection happens on individuals. The ones that are too big, they're gone. Only the ones that are small left over, which means that the whole population, let's say, is now, the survivors are all small individuals and they'll reproduce, and the next generation will be smaller individuals. So, the first thing you need is variation. The variation, not only is there variation, but it has to be heritable. What does heritable mean? Huh? Okay, from one generation to the next, right? So heritability, I talked to you probably about this. Who in here looks like their parents? Who doesn't? Milkman. Sorry. So it has, those traits are passed down. If it's not a heritable trait, and there's variation, there'll still be natural selection, but there will not be any evolution. So the variation has to be heritable, passed down from one generation to the next. Now this is, in each generation, we'll say that some individuals, because they're favored, they have traits that make them more likely to survive and reproduce more successfully than others. Okay, now how does this actually happen? Well, natural selection favors heritable trait variance. Remember, we've got variation in body size, and the body size is actually heritable from one generation to the next. And then if body size, let's say, is favored to be large, in this case, instead of small, then the next generation will mainly be individuals who are larger in body size. That's all they will be. Okay. Now, and then we have here something called fitness. Fitness is pretty simple. It's basically an individual's ability to survive and reproduce. So this is where the idea of survival of the fittest came in. Well, it's kind of misleading, like I just pointed out, because it's not always the biggest and the strongest. Okay? It can be the smallest. It can, whatever it is. Okay? But fitness means that you actually, an individual organism has to survive long enough to reproduce. The real way we look at this is how many individuals, how many offspring does an individual leave in the next generation, right? So that's why I told you earlier in the semester that to look around, see who you like, and have as much sex as possible, and that way you leave offspring, right? We want all of you to leave lots of offspring, and then you'll have high fitness, and that'll be just Jim Dandy, won't it? You all want to have high fitness, don't you? Maybe not. Okay. Anyway, that's the name of the game. Okay. So fitness is surviving and reproducing. So what happens then is evolution by natural selection, which means we have heritable trait variation, and that there's some force that favors, let's say survival, depending on body size, and that kind of sifts the individuals. Those who are not the right body size don't leave as many offspring or don't leave any. Okay, and this is called adaptation. So an adaptation is a trait that actually is the best trait in the population that allows the individual who has it to survive and reproduce better than other individuals in the population. So if something is adapted to a certain environment, then they have higher fitness, they'll leave more offspring than other individuals. So let's see here. So here we are again. Okay, so we have variation, and we'll say right here, this individual, all these other ones are about the same size. This one's different. His head is sticking out. Maybe not such a good idea to have his head sticking out. That heritable variation must actually be heritable. Okay? So all these individuals here who have certain traits in terms of body size, it has to be heritable. There's a bunch of small ones, and then there's one with a long neck. Okay. And then, in this case, there's a selective agent. And here we have selection. And it's going to be on this poor individual. Right? So he's got a hatchet. So what does he say here? It says, oh boy, who's it going to be? Who's it going to be? Poor guy with a long neck. He's sticking out. It's too bad. You could say, he's better than all the rest. He's bigger. Nah. He's going to get eaten tonight. And then, of course, we have evolution by natural selection, which leads to adaptation. In other words, in this case, the most adapted individuals are all these guys, because they're not going to get their head chopped off. Simple. So, Darwin and Wallace came up with this idea about what there had to be, variation, heritable variation, and then what natural selection was. The thing is, at the time, no one knew anything about particulate inheritance. In other words, having genes with alleles. Alleles are different gene variants. You have perhaps two alleles from your parents. They could be the same alleles, or they could be different because you're a diploid organism. And Darwin had no idea that this particulate inheritance was the way things were inherited. He thought it was more like you have a paint that's red paint and white paint, and you put it all together, you get pink paint. And that was a problem because if your traits get washed out, in other words, the variants that are best adapted to leave more offspring, but they get washed out, then you can't actually have natural selection. But at the same time, Mendel, this monk that you might have heard about, was actually working on little pea plants, and he actually showed that there was particulate inheritance. Unfortunately, no one read his stuff. His stuff was in a journal, agricultural journal or something like that. So it wasn't rediscovered until, I don't know, 1903 or something, and Mendel was 1860s. Okay, so once that was rediscovered, particulate inheritance, then suddenly we had a mechanism where natural selection or evolution by natural selection could really work. Of course, Darwin didn't know how variance rose. In other words, variation in traits, mutation, how traits were determined, and how traits were inherited. But even without that, he came up, and Wallace came up with a theory that actually explained, and actually was the mechanism for how evolutionary change happens in populations. Okay, so here we are. DNA replication is not perfect. So here what we have is double-stranded DNA, and each of these bases is an allele, and it's got a complementary base. And when this unwinds to be copied, so that you can have gametes that have either one side or the other, this stuff gets copied and then turned into proteins. Okay? So this is an allele, and we'll say that this is a different allele over here. Oops, sorry. Okay, so the bases determine what alleles are. Now, sometimes mistakes are made. There's actually a lot of mechanisms in when we go over mitosis that will fix any copy errors that happen, but some get through. Okay? So, oops, you got a little change from one, let's say, allele to another. Now, perhaps this it affects a protein that's being coded. So, DNA codes for certain proteins, not for certain traits. The proteins are the ones that actually affect traits. And sometimes that error will mean that the organism is no longer able to survive. It's a bad mutation. Sometimes, occasionally, it might be a mutation that actually increases an individual's fitness. And this mutation business happens really. Random mutations are the source of new alleles or trait variants. That's how they happen. If DNA replication, repair and replication were perfect, there would be no variation. So you'd have clones. Everything exactly the same. There could be no evolution by natural selection then. Only when there's heritable trait variants, and they come from mutation. So here's an example. During the 19th century in England, it was the start of the Industrial Revolution. Everybody was burning coal. And coal turned everything into soot. And soot covered everything. Now, there were these two different peppered moths. One was dark and one was light. And they used camouflage so that birds wouldn't come along and eat them. So here's an example. There's actually a butterfly right here. I mean a moth. Okay. And then same thing over here. A dark one. The light one stands out. If this is a soot-covered tree, then the one who survives is the dark one. In this case, if it's normal tree bark, which is light, then the light-colored one survives, and the other one dies, dark one, because birds can see it. Okay, now, these are two different environments, like I said. In one environment, the dark phase is favored. In one environment, the light phase. It was shown that as the trees darkened, individuals with the dark phase became more common, as you would expect. They're the ones, so now it's all the soot-colored, the dark-colored trees. The dark ones survive better than these ones. If this coloration polymorphism is heritable, then the next generation is all going to be, or mostly going to be, the dark phase. And then it was shown after that as they got away from coal and went to more clean energy, the trees are now not as sooty, they're lighter, and now the white phase is becoming more common. So it went back and forth. So some environments favor one form and some environments favor another. That's why there is no one trait that is the best. It all depends on the environment that the organism is in. If we're talking about our little periwinkles that are being eaten by the green crabs. So the crabs are eating the ones with thin shells. The next generation is going to be the ones with thicker shells that survive and reproduce. So evolution by natural selection is basically results in, there's genetic variation, results in unequal reproductive success. The alleles that confer an ability to survive and reproduce better than the others become more common in the next generation. So even though we say, okay, you have to survive long enough to reproduce. Let's say you survive really long but you never reproduce. You still have lousy fitness. Let's say there's a bad boy in here and he's stealing everybody else's girlfriends. And finally it gets to the point where they take it into their own hands and they wipe him out, and he's only 21 years old. But in that time, he's fathered 150 offspring. Right? He's had a good time, but he didn't live very long because of it. Okay. So the main thing is leaving offspring. So here we are again. Over several generations, the change in the genetic makeup, in other words, if these color variants are inherited from fathers and mothers to offspring, then over time the genetic makeup of the population will have changed, and the new variants will be the ones that survive best in that environment. Okay. Now, here's some examples besides just these little moths. Here we have we have bacteria. And these bacteria, let's say, are pathogenic and make people sick. We've come up with these antibiotics, that means these drugs, that actually affect these bacteria and will kill them. Okay? Now, these guys do not reproduce by sex. They reproduce by making copies of themselves that are identical to each other. Except that, thank God, occasionally there's one with a mutation. There might even be a mutation that, let's say, allows certain individuals to survive even though there's that antibiotic in the environment. So if someone gets an antibiotic, let's say tetramycin or whatever it is, all different kinds, and it wipes out all the bacteria, except these guys right here. They're resistant. Now, they were born that way, or they were made. It was all because of a mutation that they got when the bacteria were reproducing, and that mutation allowed them to survive better, even in an environment where there was lots of antibiotics around. So, they survive, and then the next generation, what's going to happen? You're going to have, and remember, bacteria reproduce very quickly, so the antibiotic might work, let's say, really well, and then suddenly the infection comes back because now the whole population is made up of these individuals that are resistant. And the antibiotic that was first used is no longer effective. So that's antibiotic resistance. It's a real big problem today. Probably what's going to happen is that there's not a lot of money to be made in antibiotics, so the government is now funding searches for new antibiotics because we've basically been using the same antibiotics since they were first discovered in the 50s. Okay, actually here. Okay. So what's the source of the genetic variation among individuals? A or B? Who's for A? Who's for B? Okay, exactly. So, the source of genetic variation is always random mutation. In this example of natural selection or evolution by natural selection, the genetic makeup of an individual changed through time or a population changes through time? Population? Okay, good. Okay, I want to make sure you guys understand that. Individuals do not change. You either are born with a certain trait or you're not. And that affects, if that trait is under selection for survival or reproduction, then it will be favored. And then the population will change over time. The individuals with a trait variant that's not favored will disappear from the population. So, actually. So here we are again. Here's the birds and the moths. This is England in the 19th century during industrial age. And of course, you can see the trees got darker because of it, and the dark variants survived better and reproduced. It became more common in the next generation. Now, same thing has been shown to happen with insects and pesticides. Same sort of thing. Some individuals are born with a mutation that maybe doesn't completely make them resistant to pesticides, but let's say a little bit better, and perhaps they leave more offspring, And then over time, the population changes until you get some sort of insect, like cotton borer or something like that, that eats these plants, and it becomes more common and resistant to the pesticide. Same thing with weeds and using herbicides, same sort of thing. So this has happened over and over and over again. It's of course a problem because you have these pesticides and herbicides that seem to work and then they don't work anymore. So here we are. We're looking at time. So here's a population of dividing microbes. We go in time. The process of growth and division produces naturally occurring variants. In this case, we've got this one and this one. Microbial population continues to multiply, occasionally giving rise to more mutants. Here is the selective pressure. So this is an antimicrobial, or in this case an antibiotic, is given to the individual. The bacteria all die off, or most of them. Microbes are killed or prevented from growing in this antibiotic. And so we'll say that all these variants right here. Okay. They die. All the white ones die. The yellow ones die. These are the two survivors. And they go on. And that's the next generation or a number of generations later. The whole population is now resistant to the bacteria. Now, antibiotics only work on bacteria. They don't work on viruses. Does anybody know what the difference between a virus and a bacteria is? Okay, one of them's dead and one of them's alive. I guess that's I guess so. One is made of cells, and the other one is made of either DNA or RNA that inserts itself into the cells of organisms. Those are the viruses. Personally, I think that viruses are alive. They reproduce, they just don't use their own machinery to reproduce. In fact, you might say they're the perfect parasite. They take over the machinery of the cell that they infect and get the cell to make copies of the virus. And viruses evolve just like anything else. They didn't come along first because obviously without a cell to infect, you're not going to have a virus that will be able to survive. So there are also antiviral drugs now being made. They're not as common. And usually there's worse side effects than with a lot of antibiotics. But antibiotics work on bacteria, and antivirals work on viruses. So here we are again, same thing. Of the population changed over time. Sexual selection. Sexual selection. In this case, that's usually, let's see, right here. Here we go. Right here, some individuals leave more offspring than others because they're either better competitors for access to females or females like them better than others. Okay. In the end, no matter what it is, the bottom line, some phenotypes leave more offspring than others. It can be all these different ways, doesn't necessarily have to be on survival. Okay, so this is selection on survival. You can see in terms of these birds and what they like. Green, they like green the best. The other ones are kind of darker. They're more like the background, and so they don't get eaten as often. Here, when the British colonized Australia, they brought some of the animals that they had at home there and let them loose. And one of them was these bunnies. And the rabbits had no natural enemies there. And they reproduced like that. They reproduced like rabbits, right? It was having lots of sex, lots of bunnies were reproduced. The population was huge. The population was eating all the grass and all the forage for all the other animals, including their sheep and cattle and the wild animals. And something had to be done. So they used a little bit of what's called biocontrol. They introduced a virus that killed about 99.9% of the bunnies. Terrible. Just completely wiped them out. Except there were just a few that were somewhat resistant to the virus. So, this is initially what happened. The introduction was around, let's say, here, actually earlier up here, and the rabbits plunged. And then there was some resistance to the virus, and so they went back up, but then there was also coevolution going on with the virus as well. So there were new virus variants that then killed the bunnies that had survived the old virus variants. And eventually, it came down to about, I guess, around 9 here. So, actually, we can see. Okay. So now they're at a fairly low level. The disease, it turns out, is still fatal like 30 to 40% of the time. The actual disease, the virus, is actually not as deadly as it used to be. It leaves more rabbits alive. There's still a lot of them die, but there's fewer that die. And then the rabbits have also evolved in tandem, co-evolved, to resist the virus. So there's no more of these really big plagues going on, and the animals are down to at least a tolerable amount. So this is selection on survival. Here's fecundity selection, the number of offspring. Here's a plant. It's making lots and lots and lots and lots of different seeds. Okay? There might be another plant that, for whatever reason, doesn't make as many seeds. And it might have to do with something that is inherited from one plant to the next. Or it could be, let's say, in one environment, let's say a good environment, though, this guy will leave lots of seeds, but in another environment, the one that doesn't leave as many seeds actually survives better than this one, and so there's a polymorphism that goes kind of back and forth. Okay. And then there's something called sexual selection that we'll get into a little bit more, but it's essentially male-male competition for access to females. So up there on the left, the top is an Irish elk. It's an extinct species of deer. It was huge. It had this huge rack. It used it, first of all, to fight other males and to intimidate other males. Even though that rack is so big, it actually kind of puts a cost on the individual with such a big rack. Sometimes he gets hung up in the trees, all sorts of bad things can happen. Okay. And then there's also a condition where there's female choice. Right? So, if a male, here's the male right here. The female, these are birds of paradise. If a female says, oh, he's nice and bright and beautiful, and does a nice dance for me, I'll have sex with him. And that's some other one that doesn't have as beautiful a plumage. Or, here we are, bigger is better. So, now we're going to get to what's called modes of selection. And we've kind of been dealing with this a little bit. Like in survival, let's say it favors one phenotype, for example, smallest to largest. There's also stabilizing selection. Well, we'll go through all of these. Here we are of the different kinds of selection. So the top, actually, we'll do this one right here. Directional selection. Here's the mean. And individuals that are small get wiped out. And then over time, the population shifts towards larger individuals. So I'm going to do it here. Okay. Here is some trait. Small to large. Let's say shell thickness. Individuals with small shells get wiped out. So here they go. The next generation, hold on a second. Now it's only mainly, let's say, these are the guys that kind of have survived. The population has shifted a little bit, and they reproduce, and then the generation after that, we look and see that the whole population has shifted from small to large because of selection, let's say on shell size, or selection on body size, something like that. That's directional selection, right? Directional selection towards small to big. Now, I have a question. Here we are again. What happens if there's selection against big size, and now we have the next where the population now is like that? Is that still directional selection? Yes. Okay. Just because at first it was smaller to larger doesn't mean that as directional selection you can also go from small to large. Large to small. Okay? So, here's an example of directional selection on beak size with Galapagos finches. These are Darwin's finches. And there's a drought that reduced the number of seeds that were available. The only seeds that were left were very, very, very hard to crack. So the only individuals who actually survived were the ones that had large beaks. So this is where the drought was, right? The population crashed to very few individuals. It crashed from, what was it, over 1,000 all the way down to maybe 80 individuals. The ones that were left over, they had bigger beaks. So here was the population mean before of beak size, and then after the drought, this is how it shifted towards this direction. And so you can actually see there's also heritability. So this is mid-parent bill depth and offspring. It's highly correlated. And over time, here's the drought right here. Over time, bill size got bigger. all based on seed hardness. Now, it turns out when the drought was over with, and you had all these new seeds that grew that were softer, it went back the other direction. Furthermore, it turns out females like males with big beaks. Gives them a charge. Okay, so this is, in this case, this is mean birth weight. I talked a little bit about this. Small babies don't survive as well. Large babies end up killing the mama more often and themselves. And so over time there's been strong selection for having birth weights between, let's see, 5 and 9 pounds. And there's less problems in that range. There's more problems small, the babies don't survive as well, and the large, the mothers and babies don't survive as well. So this is called stabilizing selection. It stabilizes right around what it was before. Here we are. We've got this kind of curve. We'll say size is right here. And it turns out that there's selection, in this case, on small and on large, and you then end up with the same kind of distribution, but very narrow all around the mean. The mean doesn't change, but the variance does. So that's stabilizing selection. So this is called disruptive selection. So originally, the mean was right here, and then over time, individuals with a small bill size or a large bill size, but not in the middle, survived and reproduced better. So we have a distribution, and instead of favoring the mean, we have something that favors either small or large and not the mean, okay, or the average. So in this case, the only ones that survive, let's say, are these. Sorry, I got it wrong. So this is it. This is it. The ones that survive are the tails, and so the small ones and the large ones. And then the ones in the middle get wiped out. And you end up with a distribution that looks like this, and then like this. There are some that are favored with, let's say, a small beak, because they eat mostly small seeds and they're very good at it, and then there's ones that eat big seeds because they have a big beak and crack it. So this is called, okay. And then there's something called negative frequency dependent selection. That sounds dangerous, doesn't it? And it is. Anybody ever fish for salmon? Okay. Now, most of the time, you want to catch a big guy, right? This guy. That's a very big salmon. But the males come in two sizes. They come in also what's called a jack salmon, that are small. So here's the deal. It takes 4 years to produce a big salmon like this, a big male like this. The females are big too, but it only takes 2 years for a jack salmon to come in. So jack salmon are sneaky males. What they do is, they're small, they actually hide behind rocks that are next to the female who's digging where she's going to lay her eggs. And then these big guys are going to be fighting each other. And while they're fighting, the little guy zips in, releases the sperm, fertilizes the eggs, while these guys are unaware of what just happened. Okay? The trouble is, there's only so many sites near a female, so there can't be too many jacks. When there's a few jacks, they have high fitness. They don't have to worry, they're always going to find a rock next to a female, and there'll be big guys fighting. Now, the more jacks become common, the less good it is to actually be a jack. In that case, there's selection instead on large salmon. So there's instead a bunch of small there's a bunch of small jacks. They have less fitness, and so the next generation, they're probably going to be making more big salmon. Okay? Because the jacks are out of it. They're competing against each other. And there might be fewer of the big ones. So it kind of, a dynamic goes from small to large with both of these different kinds of salmon. They're two different kinds of males. Of course, the ones that take 4 years, a lot of things can happen in 4 years compared to the ones that only take 2 years to become mature. These guys are small, but they're mature. And because of that, they're more likely to survive 2 years than they are 4 years, and they might make it back to the stream without being eaten by an orca. Now, we just talked a little bit about a kind of selection that favors large and small, but not in the middle. What is that called? Disruptive selection. So, not only is this frequency dependent, in other words, small for the jacks is favored, large for the big salmon is favored, but only when there's few of them. But there's also disruptive selection going on here at the same time.
He has fought all challengers and won, in fights that are sometimes to the death. Throughout the months of September and into October, this violent behavior occurs each year within the elk populations. Males, called bulls, fight each other for females, called cows, and with each successive fight, the winning bull continues to build a collection of cows, called a harem. A challenger will alert the herd bull that he wants to fight by bugling. Then, in a show of aggression, the challenger rakes trees with his antlers. If the herd bull feels the loss of his harem is threatened by a challenger, then the fight is on. And it's not over until one of them either dies or gives up and runs away in cowardice. Then, for the winning bull elk, it's back to his harem where he is king, eventually mating each female as he has proven genetically superior to all the males. And then next season, it will all begin again like this.
So this is a male-male competition. One of two kinds of sexual selection. So males fight each other for access to females. There are some cases it's where females fight access to males, like seahorses, but for the most part it's, as I mentioned. In humans it's both, and then of course the other kind is female choice. Okay. Sexual selection. Let's see here. What do I want to do? I know. Okay. So, this is a form of selection where it depends not on the struggle for survival, but on the struggle between the males for possession of females. Occasionally, it's the other way around. Like seahorses, the males actually get pregnant. And the females fight it out amongst themselves about who's going to lay in the pouch of the males. In humans, it's actually both ways. Women fight it out over men. Men fight it out over women. Well, everybody's fighting it out, right? The ones that win the fight between each other, those are the ones that leave more offspring. And that's male-male, called male-male competition. Okay? There's also, like these guys, secondary sexual characteristics that a female likes a guy who's got big gaudy feathers and really cute looking, right? And doesn't like the ones that aren't quite as cute. And this is called female choice. It allows the female to find out which males are the best, because having this kind of plumage might be kind of expensive. You might be more likely to be eaten by a predator, let's say. And then, let me